Okay, everybody. So, welcome to week 13. There is a tiny bit of a delay with my voice in the camera, and it's kind of got me weirded out, but we will press on and get into this week's presentation, just outlining where we're going, what we're doing, any sort of notable features of the week. Of course, today is the day I think the country's largely recognizing and honoring Veterans Day, though it was yesterday, the 11th day of the 11th month. I put up a field of poppies there because it's associated with the First World War, and so many of the battlefields were farms or country land. That after the battles were fought, what grew up in, to replace the sort of the battlefields, the wreckage and the remains of battles was the poppy, the flower. And so in Europe especially, and to some extent here, the poppy, the symbol of the poppy, is in relation to Veterans Day and the First World War. And also this year is the 100-year anniversary of the First World War. It ended in 1918, went from 1914 to 1918, and so also I wanted to sort of recognize the First World War. Okay, so in addition to that, today we have a few other things to discuss. Of course, the official course evaluations, which go directly to CEI, are now up and available, and the college is really seeking student feedback. And I know that they would also really like to get student feedback from online courses because they're trying to get more online courses developed. And as a history course, you guys would be of particular interest to administrators because this is the first online history course the college has ever had. They only started offering history courses last fall. So then to have an online course now is, we're very much a new thing in the process of developing. So if you can it doesn't take long at all, if you can take a few moments to complete the course evaluations, it would be greatly appreciated. I do not see any of the data and the feedback from the course evaluations until after final grades are submitted. So it is well and truly anonymous. I did record a new peer review presentation. I think I did that late last week. I went back and watched it, and it seems to be okay. No skipping slides this time, but I did misspeak. I said something I think it was on slide 2 about you shouldn't be doing any additional research beyond the peer review, and what I meant was be doing any additional information beyond the book review. So you're selecting a classmate's book review, and that is what you read, and that essentially research for your peer review. So I misspoke there. For the peer review, you read somebody else's book review and offer analysis and some reflection on what you learned from that. Something in sort of anticipation of the holidays. So the Center for New Directions on campus, I've mentioned here a couple times. They are orchestrating the applications for Toys for Tots Christmas Assistance Program. And so the application for that is a little less than a month away on December 8th. Oh, and that should say December 18th, December 8th, 2018. I copied and pasted that directly from the email that was sent out from Center of New Directions. So yeah, I hope that the December 8th is accurate. But sooner rather than later would probably be a good approach to that. And those can be picked up at the Center for New Directions office, which is in Building 5, which is where a lot of classrooms are anyways if you're taking on-site courses. Room 582. If I remember correctly, it's on the far north side of the building. And then I will be on campus for the office hour today rather than doing a Zoom office hour. So you're welcome to stop by Building 1 if you'd like. And I try to stick close to the office, but I do teach a class, an evening class, and so sometimes I'm off making copies or different things for that. So if you come by and I'm not there, please just shoot me a quick email. And I'm on campus and I'm usually really close by, so I can get over there quickly if needed. So this week we have a little bit of a different week in that I switched out the peer review for the discussion board just because the peer review, I want those to get done by the end of the week. So we can sort of put that, whoa, go back there. I didn't even click on anything, so I don't know what happened. In any case, I want to get these peer reviews done before we get too much in the holiday frame of mind. And there's not a lot of reading, but I did also include some viewing assignments. And with the Civil War being our focus this week, it's sort of an intense week. It's not necessarily very heavy. You know, anytime we study the war or a war, particularly the Civil War, it's a really formative period in American history, it's going to absorb a lot of attention. So cut out the discussion board, sort of substituted the peer review for that because we have some peer-to-peer interaction going on there. And so, yeah, they're close in nature to some extent. And then, of course, we have the study guide, the quiz, and the learning journal also due at the end of the week. So 3 topic outlines from AP US History notes, and then some really short viewing assignments. So I think the first one is about 5 minutes, the second one is about 2 minutes, and the last one is about 6 minutes. So not heavy there, and there's only a handful of questions associated with each of the viewing assignments. Okay, so some of the primary sources that we're going to be looking at is the Fugitive Slave Act. And that might sound familiar. You might say, wait, we already had the Fugitive Slave Act. But there's a distinction. What we saw was in relation to the Constitution. That was the Fugitive Slave Clause. It was a clause of the Constitution. And now this is an act of Congress. So there's a distinction there. That's why I also added of 1850 to make sure we're not talking about the one that was created during the Constitutional Convention. Supreme Court case Abelman versus Booth, a really significant decision in relation to the status of African Americans and slaves in particular in America during the mid-1800s. Uncle Tom's Cabin, something that some of you will have had some experience with already or may come to this week, was published in the years leading up to the Civil War. And it's sort of like I was talking about for those of you that have watched the peer review presentation. So when we hear stories or we read stories, our brains connect with that on a number of levels in ways that just hearing facts and statistics and stuff, there's some overlap, but it goes above and beyond that. And so stories really resonate with people. People make personal connections with stories that they might not necessarily make with just data or information or facts. And so we see this resonance at the time, and I think it comes through in the reading pretty clearly that Uncle Tom's Cabin made slavery and slaveholders real to people. They weren't just sort of in the abstract anymore, but people began to imagine them, you know, in flesh and blood, and to have feelings for those people. Same with 12 Years a Slave. This isn't something that is mentioned in the readings, but it's something that I feel like is important, not just because a Hollywood movie was made over it and it won the Academy Award and all that, but because it is, whereas Uncle Tom's Cabin is fiction, 12 Years a Slave is nonfiction. It really happened to an actual individual. And so it's representative of something that was going on at this time, where people who were free, or maybe even born free, or had been given their freedom, living in the North, who were Africans, who were blacks, they would often be kidnapped and sold into slavery. So slavers would sort of pose as respectable businessmen or something, and they would try to get blacks as close to that border between North and South, between legal ownership and illegal ownership of blacks. And so they would get them as close as they could to the border, and then they would kidnap them and really quickly smuggle them across the border. And this happened with adults, and it happened with children. And that's also what the video on Boy Runaway is about. It's just in the case of a child rather than an adult being kidnapped and sold into slavery. So yeah, a couple distinctions there, but that's sort of the gist of it. And 12 Years a Slave also resonated at the time, because like Frederick Douglass, Solomon Northup had some ability to sort of capture how it felt to be in this situation, and those feelings become really powerful to people who read this and take time to sort of reflect on it, and not just abolitionists, but other people who are sort of more casual about slavery now become less casual. Okay, the Kansas and Nebraska Act, we'll see it was really upset sort of the sectional status quo, and we see a lot of violence and a lot of really hard feelings forming during and after the creation of the Kansas and Nebraska Act. Again, it's to do with admitting new states into the Union, and would they be slave or free. And it also it doesn't make too much of a big deal about this in the reading, but it also relates to there was Indian territory there, and again they're pushed off because a senator who owned some stocks in a railway wanted to see the railway go through what was Indian territory, and so he was able to push that through Congress. The Emancipation Proclamation is mentioned. It will be, and it's worth noting in relation to our discussion this week, but it's also discussed next week, but I decided it'd be appropriate to include it in this week. And then also the Gettysburg Address. And I've included the text for the Gettysburg Address. It's less than 300 words. So I've included that in the study guide for you guys to read over. And some important locations: Kansas, Nebraska, and then Richmond, Virginia, which is, and also I need to have on there Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So Richmond, Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy, or was the capital of the Confederacy. Vicksburg, Mississippi was a major turning point in the war, as was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So I'll put those up on the sort of the Unit 3 exam preview that I do, but yeah, make sure Kansas, Nebraska, Richmond, Virginia, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania are sort of in your spatial zone this week. You're physically locating them in your mind. Okay, so like I said, we're talking about the Civil War this week. It's a hugely formative time in American history, and so I just have a few slides. I sort of condense some information into a few slides to go over some of the broad features and maybe some of the more significant facts, figures, and a couple maybe salient details. one thing to bear in mind is what a central role, of course, and I don't think I'm telling you guys anything that you haven't picked up on from the readings. The issue of slavery was at the heart of the sectional crises that punctuated American history, really from the Constitutional Convention up to the Civil War. So in 1800, you could buy a slave for about $15. By 1859, minimum of about $125, and like you'll see with the video on Solomon Northup, upwards of $1,000 if it was a hardy male in his prime working age. And that's because Britain and most European countries, if not all of them, had outlawed the slave trade. And so now they're not getting the same influx of new stock, so to speak, to the slave market. And so they're trying to utilize what blacks there are in America, whether they're in the South or not. And also they're trying to, they're more valuable because they can't be replenished nearly as easily. We see that most of the whites' financial capital in the South is tied up in owning slaves. So rather than investing in building factories or building shops or building roadways, instead their money is used to buy slaves and maintain their plantations. So it's a profitable system, but one that can easily have its feet knocked out from underneath it, and it doesn't create a great deal of infrastructure, which is really problematic. It makes the South dependent on outside people and countries for a great many things. So they had a lot of confidence going into the war about their battle savvy and the capabilities of their generals and all of this, but really anybody that had studied warfare, especially siege warfare as it becomes, would say they were not in a very good position to go into war. In any case, a few other sort of important facts here that where we see the slaves being central to this is that the slave population in the South is enormous. By 1830 in Mississippi, we already have more slaves than whites. Because of the high demand for slaves, we see that families were increasingly being split up, and this really rankles with the abolitionists and Christian Northerners generally. This is seen as very inhumane, whereas before efforts were made to keep families together. Now it's seen as sort of common practice and taken for granted that they will be split up. We see that runaways are made examples of by being, punished for their attempted runaways, and because the idea of losing a slave is horrifying to the slave owners because of the fact of how difficult it is to replace them and how costly it is to replace them. And the idea that could give other slaves any ideas about running away is also horrifying. And so this dependency of the South on the institution of slavery and on their individual slaves, we see has a really what one historical source calls a corrosive effect on the personalities of Southerners, that they become obsessed with this slavery issue, and they see constant threats from all sides to the institution of slavery. They think the North is out to get them. They think the slaves are out to get them, and it makes them become much more of a brutal people in a way. Like the source says, it caused basically decent people to commit countless petty cruelties. The source goes on to say, for hotheads, alcoholics, or others with psychological problems, the power could be brutalizing. And this is something you'll see with Solomon Northup, is he talks about that not all slave owners are the same, but there are some that maybe have sort of a real temper problem, or in some cases a substance abuse problem, that the idea of owning another human being, they almost get drunk on the power that this gives them, and they use this to brutal effects. And so we also see the centrality of slavery once the South does secede and becomes the Confederate States of America. They adopt a constitution that's really more alike to the Articles of Confederation than the Constitution as it became in the United States of America. So when they secede, the vice president of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens, he gives a speech, and he lays out what this new nation is all about, you know. And one quote from that speech that he gives is, "Its foundations are made and its cornerstone rests on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." So you hear people often throwing out different reasons for the Civil War, and oftentimes the idea of states' rights is used as to justify war, and that slavery was sort of a side issue, that it was really about states' rights. And that's a little bit tricky of an argument, because remember, the South was not opposed to imposing its will on the North through the Runaway Slave Act and other things that made it so people had to be beholden to the will of Southern plantation owners. So people felt that their states' rights and their individual civil rights were subordinated to the will and the power of the South. And so it really went both ways, you know. The tariff was something that the South was always complaining that the North was trying to impose upon them. Their values, their ethics, and the sort of thing. But the same went for the South, that when they wanted to, they were more than willing to apply every effort to try to control the actions of Northerners in ways that would be conducive for them. So states' rights is a little bit tricky. What it really came down to was subjugating human beings to the status of property, and whether or not that was going to be okay or not. And eventually, most of the people in the North came to feel like this was not going to be okay. The Second Great Awakening played a major role in that, and the spread of the abolitionist movement. But also, like I said, just your average, normal, everyday folk went to church and became increasingly sort of reflective on this, that this really isn't okay. There were still those in the North that, while they might not have agreed with it, still didn't come out against it because they were making a lot of money off of Southern cotton. And that's a point to bear in mind, is that there were those in the North that did get rich right alongside the Southerners off of the institution of slavery. In any case, to try to sort of shuffle the issue of slavery over as a sort of a side issue or tangential in some way is really ahistorical. It's just inaccurate, based off of primary source evidence, straight from the mouth of the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens himself. It's also built into many Southern states' constitutions after they secede and they rewrite their constitutions. Okay, so a few facts and figures, as it says there, that are sort of indicative of what this war was like. That it is a tremendously deadly conflict. That I think our reading puts it at around 600 deaths And that's about in line with what, for a number of years, the estimates were at. They were right around 620,000. But more recent research has yielded figures more along the lines of around 750,000. Sort of a high-end estimates are 850,000, and the low end is now at 650,000. And most think it's somewhere in between there. So to compare with that, the Second World War lost just under 500,000, or just over 400,000. The Revolutionary War, so on the, if you were a colonialist and you were a patriot, you were fighting for the revolution, then it was about 25,000, and if you were a loyalist fighting against the revolution on behalf of the British, about 7,000. And I could carry that on to, there's also the First World War, and there's also the Vietnam and Korean wars, or Korean conflict as it's officially known. But that gives you some perspective in relation to things, and also that in terms of perspective, that in 1860, the population of the entire country was only about a tenth of the size it is today. So if the war were fought today, then if we put that to scale, the number of deaths would be around 6 million. As is fairly well known about the Civil War, that more soldiers died off the battlefield than on it, and this was not uncommon for warfare up to really recent years. Battlefield medicine was not something that really got going until about this time. The Crimean War in Europe, you start to have Florence Nightingale and some other notable nurses, Mary Seacole, who begin to sort of professionalize nursing and battlefield medicine sort of hand in hand. Also, the Russians during the Crimean War invented ambulances to sort of get people off the field of battle and out to get them help. And triage. There's a number of things, but they really don't impact the American Civil War very much. For those that died in battle, there are almost as many being killed by a bayonet wound as being shot. So you can see oftentimes things sort of disintegrated into basically hand-to-hand combat. Anybody who's seen the movie Cold Mountain can see this. Is it the Battle of Fredericksburg? But you can see battle lines break, and people are basically fighting it out in very close quarters, close enough to get stabbed. So it was an ugly, in-your-face sort of fighting. It's notable to think that most of those who fought in the Civil War had grandparents who fought in the Revolutionary War, so who were compatriots, who were on the same side against the British. It's also, this isn't something, I didn't come across it in the reading unless I just spaced out for a minute. I don't think it's there, but it is very notable that almost always you'll see, if you read anything about the Civil War, you'll see 2 names for the same battle. And that's because the North gave the battle a name, and then the South gave it a different name. So they weren't really in league with one another in terms of ironing out their differences, especially when it came to what they were going to call any given battle. So the North generally named things after natural landmarks, most often rivers or streams, whereas the South named things more of man-made structures, usually cities or towns. So almost always, like first Bull Run is Manassas, or First Manassas. So there's always that distinction to be cognizant of there. Okay, so secession is what the southern states do. To secede, it's spelled differently than succeed and pronounced slightly different. To secede is the withdrawal of a group from a larger entity, especially a political entity, but also any organization, union, or military alliance. And I'm sure I got that quote from somewhere, and I should have given some acknowledgement of where that came from. But it's a pretty standard sort of definition of secession. So when Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, 7 southern states secede to form a new nation. In time, others would join them, but initially it's Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. Sort of in succession within a few months after the election. The Lincoln administration, and really most of the North, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the succession. What many understood is that this would create, as the quote says, a fatal precedent that would eventually fragment the no longer United States into several squabbling countries. So you probably have the North, the South, the Oregon Territory, the Mexican cession, maybe Texas on its own, because, you know, enough said. They like to sort of be on their own. They see themselves as it's a little bit different. I say that with experience of having lived in Texas and taken Texas history. It's not just personal bias or something. In any case, we'd have something probably more akin to Europe than really the United States of America as it is presently constituted, which would have made fighting in the First World War and the Second World War a heck of a lot more challenging. Okay, so with Lincoln's election, we have the secession of the several states. We have the Confederate Constitution drafted. Like I said, it's much more similar in its intent and its text to the Articles of Confederation than the Constitution. We have this fellow over here on the right of the screen, Jefferson Davis, being elected president, whereas Alexander Stephens was vice president. All of the federal land in the South is seized by the Confederate States of America. And Lincoln does nothing about the secession. He does not recognize it. He does not acknowledge it. He believes it to be illegitimate and ill-founded, to say the least. He states outright that a husband and wife may be divorced, which was quite a liberal point of view for the time, but the different parts of our country cannot. And while that sounds kind of harsh, one shouldn't be mistaken that he took a harsh tact at all. In his inaugural speech, his tone is far more aimed at reconciliation and recognizing the common bonds and the shared history, and sort of just like it's sort of like a marriage. That look, we have some hard times, but you know, let's stick with it. The sort of thing. He says, we are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. And he continued to speak in the same sort of tone and with the same intent, pretty much throughout the war, including when it appears as though the end of the war is very near and the North will be successful. He doesn't rub it in the faces of the South. He takes a very, like I said, very reconciliatory approach to this. He really, it starts out and remains to a large extent a war about the preservation of the Union. And you'll see in the reading, if the North had better generals who are not as intimidated by the Southern generals, there were a couple opportunities, one in particular where they probably could have won the war fairly early on, and the war would have just remained a war about the preservation of the Union. In time, with the Emancipation Proclamation, it becomes a war about the preservation of the Union and also what many see to be the preservation of American ideals of liberty, of justice, of fairness. And so it also becomes about the emancipation of slaves and it really sort of the abolition of the institution of slavery altogether. So right after these states secede, Lincoln really does not take a strong hand. He does not call for troops. He does not send in the existing army. Instead, he takes a really sort of odd approach, what some would seem, and he builds what we can call a balanced cabinet. And what that means is he has a lot of people on his cabinet that really don't like him, that really don't think that well of him. And that's the point, is that he wants people who will not just be yes men, but will give him their honest opinion, because he really wants to win this thing, and he knows he might need to listen to people that don't necessarily, like I say, get along with him that well or see his perspective that well. He recognizes we have some very differing points of view in this country, and if we're gonna save this thing, we have to consider these different points of view, and we have to work together. This idea of excluding one side and building just a team of allies is not going to work. So instead, he builds what is historically commonly known as a team of rivals. And there's a really well-known book called A Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin that talks about this, how success was achieved through these sort of duking it out in these presidential cabinet meetings with different sort of points of view coming from all different sides. Okay, so it seems that, okay, there's war, but there's not really war, right? The states have seceded, but not really anything has happened as a result, and that ends with the Battle of Fort Sumter. And as much as it really is a battle, it's just sort of an attack and a defense. So there's a federal fort off the coast of South Carolina, meant to as protection and to sort of monitor things. And so they are off the coast, so they're sort of an island on their own out there. But they begin to run low of supplies, and they're not getting resupplied because Lincoln realizes that to send a federal Union vessel into Charleston Harbor will not be welcomed by the Confederate States of America, who are not responding to Washington's request to do so. And so finally Lincoln takes, the executive decision, and he sends in supplies, and the Confederates block it on April 12th, 1861. They attack the fort, and there's 34 hours of continuous bombardment. And so really this is our Lexington and Concord moment of the Civil War. This is the first shots have been fired, and war is now a reality. Lincoln calls for volunteers for the military, and Northerners are galvanized, to stop this, to preserve the Union and not let the South get away with this. We have 4 further states joining the Confederacy in Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And we have the, let me see if I can pull up a pointer really quickly. We have border states. So these states here remain border states, meaning that they don't actively side with the North or the South. They're sort of like a demilitarized zone. And so some states that had slaves, like Missouri and Kentucky and West Virginia and Maryland and Delaware, they're not necessarily opposed to the institution of slavery, but they are not inclined toward secession. And of course, the Union does everything they can to make sure that they don't go over to the other side. So there's a lot of things that happen as a result in terms of the fighting and all this. But one of the most key aspects is, like I said, anybody familiar with siege warfare knows that the South is in a really weak position. And that's what Lincoln gets together with his team of rivals, with his cabinet, and they hash out a plan. And there's a land component, of course, but there's also a sort of a larger strategy. in addition to the individual fighting that's going to happen in Pennsylvania and Virginia and Kentucky and Georgia and all these different places. There's this ultimate strategy of winning victories in such a way, both naval victories and land territorial victories. The South will be blockaded, basically, from getting in any new supplies or being able to send out anything that they can generate income, revenue from. So this happens really early on, with the beginning of the North gaining control of the waterway here. It's talked about in the reading with the Battle of the Ironclads, the first sort of armored ships. And so, like I say, you'll read about that. So they gain control there, and they continue to fight naval battles and win victories. And then we have the Battle of New Orleans, which is really critical. And really, this does come up to Texas. But what is really, it comes up the Mississippi. Because remember, the Mississippi we've talked about, the reading has talked about, it's the lifeline of trade in the West and in the South. So this is how, if once the North is able to get control of the Mississippi, they block the southern states, sort of over here, from being resupplied from agriculture that's going on in the West. So while they can grow cotton and grow it well, and maybe some rice and some indigo and some tobacco and some other cash crops, they're being deprived of a lot of the food supplies that they normally would have gotten in from the West, from commercial agriculture in the West. It was often shipped down through the Mississippi or one of the tributaries or of the Mississippi. And so it's really a strangling, a sort of anaconda effort here, is to squeeze the South to prevent anything from coming in or going out. So they take a long road, the North takes a long road strategy fairly early on in recognizing that we can do this. We have superior technology, we have superior military efforts and supplies and more numerous men. We have the will of a good majority of the people in the North. So in addition to fighting directly coming down from the North into the South, and at times the South coming up into the North, as they did quite a bit, there's also this larger sort of grand strategy going on, which is effective. It was a combination of both, really. There was the cutting off of supplies and a way to generate revenue, and there's also sort of the military defeats that the North is able to deliver, especially Gettysburg and some of these from 1863 to 1865. Okay, so you'll read more about the war in the reading this week and also next week. But for now, we'll wrap things up. Just look briefly at what's coming up. So this probably is something that you're all getting sick of seeing because we've seen it a few times before. So next week, we have our regular weekly schedule, no book reviews, no peer reviews, just our discussion board, study guide, quiz, learning journal, all that. The only difference is that instead of having everything due Sunday night, I'm going to have things due the following Tuesday night. And that is a change from the syllabus, which is part of the reason why I've been announcing it ad nauseum, because anytime there's a change from the syllabus, that needs to be acknowledged. Week 15, though, we return to our regular weekly schedule. So everything will be posted on Monday, and everything will be due on Sunday. Even though you don't have to begin working on it on Monday, it will be available if you choose to. And then week 16 will be given entirely to the Unit 3 exam and the learning summary. And those are due December 8th, which is also a change from the syllabus, and so should be noted. Okay, so that is all I have for you guys. I hope that you find this week's material interesting, and if you have any questions about the peer review, please don't hesitate to put something up in the questions and conversations board or email me. But essentially, you're learning what you can from somebody else's efforts to do the book review. You're learning what was the significance of that work during the time that it was published. How does it reflect its day and age? And sort of what you felt was particularly noteworthy. So there's, like I said, the presentation about that goes into a little bit more detail, breaks down grading. So yeah, that's all I really have for you at this time. I hope you all have a great week. It's getting cold and frosty, so stay warm and stay safe. And I'll see you all in not the discussion boards. I'll see you all somehow. Take care. Bye-bye.